Mediterranean Highlanders, and I will focus my research, my speech on the communities of Central Italy, of the Apennines of Central Italy. And with a focus on the Aterno Valley, we will see that which part of the area, which part of Italy this is. But my special focus is on the relationship between violence and identity, how violence shaped the identity of these people. So first of all, I think that violence is a very timely topic, especially these days, because unfortunately in the news violence is everywhere, war is everywhere, and we are starting realizing that violence is not so far away from our European way of life. So whenever speaking about violence, we always have to be careful, because there are a lot of ethical issues around it, and we have to realize that violence is always violence, even if it happened millennia ago or centuries ago. So there needs to be a bit we need to be careful when we think about violence. And the second thing is that, on a lighter note, let's say, is that identity and violence have a very tricky relationship that's both obvious and counterintuitive. Let's see what first. Okay, so first of all, that's another caveat, let's say. So archaeology of violence comes with an extra bias. Archaeology always comes with a bias, of course, but with the archaeology of violence, there is an extra layer of it, because we are usually somewhere in between the victim, the perpetrator, and the observer. And each one of these point of views, they've got a different idea of whatever is going on, and they have a very personal, different point of view on whatever is happening. So whenever we're reading, we're analyzing, we're considering data coming from this kind of context, we have to be aware which side of this triangle we are considering. And then there is the archaeologist that is centuries or millennia away from whatever happened. And yeah, again, we need to be careful. But first of all, let's define violence. So violence comes from competition, but competition occurs when two or more individuals or populations or species simultaneously use a resource that is actually or potentially limited. But a competition is not necessarily violent, although, I mean, the academic world would be a very dangerous place. So it's not. I mean, it can be dangerous, but not in violence, though. So competition is not necessary violence, and violence is definitely not necessary war. There are three different things. They can be related, but they're three different things. And also, recent studies have proven that physical and close-range violence happens less often than we usually think. So we have got they did a research on the veterans of Afghanistan and Vietnam, and they realized that there is a mechanism in our brain that prevents us essentially to commit violence, close-range violence. So long-range violence is different. So when people actually commit close-range violence, is because they feel like it's the only option, or they're forced by something. So whenever it comes to proper violence, it means that that is perceived as the most efficient way to solve competition. So how can we define violence at the end of the day? So violence is an act of physical hurt deemed legitimate by the performer and some witnesses. So violence is a performative act, essentially. And is seen as as an act of social performance, and it stays an ideological message in front of an audience. So it needs an audience, and it needs an ideology, a narrative around it. Of course, we are not speaking about private violence. That's a different thing. We're speaking about, even private violence needs a sort of an audience, needs something to be expressed to. For this reason, violence is made not only for practical acts of violence, so the proper violence, but also of symbolic actions that conveys the idea of legitimacy. So that means that violence needs a set of ideas that actually legitimate it. And the most efficient way to legitimate violence is through the manipulation of memory. And the legitimacy of violence has three main aspects. So first, it recreates models and behaviors from the past. It's not necessarily a real past. It can be an idealized past, a created past, okay? Second, it appeals to strong feelings of social closure and identity, and it's us against them. And the third aspect is that violence is usually the most direct way of asserting past and identity. So it's sort of a circle. So the manipulation of memory is the main aspect which creates the legitimacy of violence. But violence, on the other hand, we say that it creates identity in a way, because violence is also a form of association. So the individuals involved in a violent act, in a fight, develop an emotional and cognitive relationship with the opponent. And on the other hand, the protect and share experience of violence creates new social patterns. Of course, when a bunch of people are fighting, they create a relationship between them, like people staying on the same side, but also with the enemies, because they share a very emotional and very traumatizing experience. So they are all together in the same boat, let's say. Okay, so that experience, that collective experience of violence, let's say, it creates social pugnancy that is not an individual attribute, but it's actually a phenomenon that comes from the context, from the interplay between structure and agency, like between the interaction of all the social agents. So, just to sum up this first part, the salient elements of violence are these four. So close-range violence is rare and only occurs when it is or it's perceived as the most efficient way to resolve a conflict. Violence at the community level can be understood as social pugnancy, hence the result of a number of contingencies all concurring to it. Violence is also a social act and needs legitimation, and this happens mainly through the manipulation of memory. And finally, violence is a form of association that creates new social patterns with those fighting on the same side as much as with the opponents. So let's go on. Let's focus a bit. Let's take all this theory and put aside for a moment, and let's focus a bit on the case study area. As I said at the beginning, I am going to focus on the Mediterranean, on the mountains of central Italy. But Mediterranean mountains are a very special environment. They are not mountains as understood in the Alps or other very high mountains of the world, like the Rocky Mountains or the Himalaya or so on. But they're still mountains, and they have any other mountainous landscape. They are essentially subject to cyclical overshoot that often resolve in war, conquest, but also in migration, colonization of new environmental niches. So what happens? It happens that at some point, I don't know if you, maybe I have got a pointer here. No, but what happens is that at some point the population start to rise because there are resources, but then they reach the critical point where resources are not enough for everyone, and so the population drops. Of course, this is a simplification. It's much more complex than that. But this is a periodical fluctuation in the population of this area. So the point of these populations is always keeping the balance between the resources and the number of people, because a lower number of people means that there are not enough people to actually gather the resources, but too many people, it actually means that the resources are not enough. So it's always a delicate balance between these two elements. So this is just a pretty picture of mountains. The mountains present rugged, broken terrain, often great distances from center of governance, which inhibits or prevents centralizing efforts such as large-scale crop cultivation, transport system, and communication. This means that mountains are often so not far away in terms of distance, but in terms of permeability. They're difficult landscapes to be permeated. And it means that colonization, occupation, conquest, it's much more difficult from the outside. So it's a sort of it's not an entirely closed environment, but tends to be closer than plains, for example. And it has a very tight relationship with the landscape. People are shaped by the landscape as much as the landscape is shaped by the people. So it's a continual discourse between people and landscape. And it's not unidirectional, it's of course in both directions. So, as I say, mountainous landscapes are constantly between change and slow pace. Because of course they're very statical for a long while, and then something happens, and being very delicate landscapes, everything changes very quickly. And so mountains people are usually thought to be very resistant, very traditional, but what they are is actually being very resilient, we would say, okay? So very able to adapt to the quick changes of an unpredictable landscape. That cannot, maybe it will not change for centuries, but then it will change through a night. We have seen it with many earthquakes in central Italy, that tradition have stayed there for years, centuries, and then everything changed in a matter of few seconds. So that's exactly my study area. So that's L'Aquila. I don't know how many of you is familiar with the geography of central Italy, but this is Italy, first of all. This is Rome, and the case study area is over there, the Vestini area. So this is L'Aquila, modern L'Aquila, and Chieti, and Pescara. So this is my case study area that I've called, well, it's called in the Roman sources, it's defined as Vestinicis Montani, but that's probably a later name, or anyway, is a label given from the outside. It's a bit more controversial, the name of these people, so I will not dive into it. But let's keep the name for sake of clarity, let's say. This is the typical landscape of the Apennines, with high mountains. That's the Gran Sasso, the highest peak of the Apennines, and that's the kind of high mountainous, a bit arid kind of landscape. Speaking about resources, as you can see in this picture, most of the area is actually dedicated to pastures. It's grassland. It's very good for livestock, but not very good for crops. Although there are some areas that can actually dedicated to agriculture. I think that Daddy would recognize this picture. I stole it from your case study. But yeah, this is the area that can actually be dedicated to agriculture, but it's not an intensive agriculture, and it's mostly dedicated to lentils and legumes and this kind of crops. A bit of chronology. So for my PhD thesis, for my PhD dissertation, I actually worked on all these periods, but during this conference, during this lecture, I will focus on this red square. And that is usually considered to be the second period, like the phase 2, or it depends on who you're asking. But it's essentially from the end of the 7th century BC to the first half of the 5th century BC. And it's the, let's say, the highlight of the Vestini culture. So that's more or less the geopolitical landscape of the period. So in that direction, there are the Sabini. Here there are Marsi and Equi, the Pellinians over there, the Vestini Transmontani on the other side of the mountains, and the Brutuzzi there on the north. So as you can see, there's this Vestinicis Montani are squeezed between a number of other people. And they really seem to care about the borders of the small number of valleys and mountains, because that's the Gran Sasso range. This is that one, the highest, the white point is the Gran Sasso, and that yellow line, sorry, that yellow line is a wall of rock, essentially, cannot be crossed. I mean, it's very difficult even today. There are a lot of people dying trying to do that, even during summertime. So it's a dangerous place. But there are some passes over there, for example, and then it continues. The geography of the area is a bit gentler, let's say, and it's a bit gentle there, and it's you can cross it there and there. And then here is a bit more confused. It's a bit more rugged, let's say. There are more passes, but they're a bit more dispersed in the landscape, and there are two passes through the landscape. And then there is this. This is a sort of buffer area, let's say. This is a plateau, and it's permeable on only two points, essentially. But we will see then that this is more a bit of a buffer area, let's say. And then here, that's the modern area of L'Aquila. That is not very defensible, but there are a couple of settlements that actually can tell us that they were actually occupying that part of the valley. And that's the main passage through the landscape. And then finally, and this is the last point where the territory is permeable. So as you can see, the number of white arrows, it's good, but it's not so good. There are very specific narrow points in the landscape where this area is actually accessible. And even within the area that we're considering, we can divide at least 4 zones, let's say. So the first one is actually the L'Aquila Valley. The second one, so this is actually the Aterno Valley, the proper Aterno Valley. This one is the Aterno. And the second one, that's the plain, the plateau of Navelli. And that's the plain of the Valley of Capestrano, I'm sorry. The Valley of Capestrano, that it's famous for the warrior, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that's it. And that's the 4th zone that is actually pure high mountain. Okay, we're speaking about an average level above the sea level of between 1.200 and 2,000. So pretty high. For the Apennines, of course. We're not speaking about the Alps again. So now let's compare this to the settlement pattern. These squares, they are all settlements. When I say settlements, let's say more sites than settlements. There are fortified settlements. Some of them, they're just towers, other proper settlements, but we will get there. So that's the first line that is very visible here. I don't know if that's. Do you see the yellow line? Okay, yeah. That's the first one. I think it's very visible that they were quite worried that somebody came from that direction. And that's the second one. As I say, that's a buffer zone. Like they're protecting this point, and then this is pretty much open. Although in the Roman sources, this area should not be part of the Vestinicis Montani area. So maybe it's, I don't know, something that they didn't consider, or I don't know. Sorry. And that's the final point. They still defend that point over there, that it's, as I say, it's very permeable, this side of the valley, but still they decided to defend it, probably for this very reason. And even within the landscape, within the territory, they decided to defend it. So the first one is actually what divides the 4th zone, the high mountain zone, with the other zones, and then this divides the Navelli Plateau with the Capestrano Valley. And then here, this mountain range actually divides from the other valley there. And that's, I think, the most visible point in the landscape where actually there is a proper line of fortifications. What happened here? Okay. So this is a visibility on the landscape from the hill forts. So the red zones are the most visible points while the pinkish ones and the whitish ones are the ones that are not visible, whether they are not very visible, while all the rest is not visible. That means this map tells us that combines the visibility of each of these settlements and highlights the points that are most visible from each of the hill forts. And if we look at the map here, we realize that the most controlled areas are actually the ones that are passageways through the landscape. So the first one is the line over there that is very well guarded and protected, and the second one is the mountain range here, and the third one is the point actually dividing the Navelli Plateau from the valley of Capestrano. So let's look a bit at the settlements that I mentioned before. So there are three classifications, three categories of these settlements. The first one is very small, less than 1 hectare, and they are nothing more than towers or just enclosures. And the second one, they're medium and they're around 1 hectare. As you can see, they are a bit more complex. And the third ones, they are of very large dimension, between 3 and 5 hectares, and they are very big for the average of the general. There are just a few, just 3 or 4 of these. So let's see one of the main and one of the biggest settlements in the area. So this is Montecerro, and it's about 5 hectares. And this is the plan, and this is a section of the excavation did by a French team in 2000. Well, I think it was 2010 or 11. Where is it? 11, yes. And as you can see from this LiDAR picture, the walls are pretty visible. And they've got a postern here. Sorry. Where is it? They've got a postern here somewhere, and they've got a main gate, and they've got a double line of fortification here on this very corner, which is also the highest point of the settlement. This is one of the very few actually dug settlements in the area. This is the other one. This is called de la Battaglia. That very evocatively means the hill of the battle, or battlefield, you decide. Anyway, it's very visible even today. That's a picture that I did a couple of summers ago. Has a postern. There are some square buildings and some terraces. There is a very clear main axis on the gentlest slope of the hill, well, of the mountain actually, and then there is a double line of fortification over there on the northern corner that has been defined from somebody like the Acropolis, but maybe it's not correct to speak about Acropolis in this context, but it gives you the idea. As you can see, it's a complex settlement, and one of the few excavated together with Montecerro. And these unfortunately are not excavated, but they're very clear from aerial photography. This is Mare Gelato. It's very small. It's about less than half a hectare. And then there is Croce di Picenze, that it's a bit larger. They're all very visible. As you can see, they're very visible from satellite. And here, this is a very special one. This is Serra di Navelli and has probably can you see that? Maybe not very much, but yeah. What can be considered an enclosure, maybe for ship animals to be rescued in case of necessities. So, just summing up this settlement pattern stuff, the settlement pattern here is optimized for defense and the control of the valley floors and the passages through them. So it's very optimized for control. The architecture is made to impress double lines of fortification, very thick fortification, a number of postern, main gates, and terraces, and the Acropolis. well, the Acropolis. So the architecture is made to impress, but also to be functional. And the two things are absolutely not exclusively mutual. Mutually exclusive. And the settlement pattern reveals the existence of at least 4 territorial districts within the area of those traditionally considered as vestinicis montani, and a structured organization of the human landscape. So these people are actually organizing the landscape around the defense and the control of it. I will now show a bit of the funerary evidence coming from the area. This is the number of all the cemeteries found in the area. As you can see, it's a lot of sites. The number of graves, the total number of graves is around 4,000 graves for all the periods in exam. Well, for this period, it's probably 1,000 and something, but still is a big number considering the average number of graves that you can find in central Italy. But for sake of essentially shortness, and also because we don't have the entire day, although I could keep you here talking about it the entire day, but maybe you don't want to. I will stick to these 4 that are the 4 main cemetery of the area. The first one is Bazzano, is the biggest one, and the total number of graves is 1,662. It covers from the end of the, for more or less the 8th century up until the Roman times, well, the beginning of the Roman times, so the Republican times. So it's a long period for sure. But it's also very interesting because it's, if we look at this is Bazzano, if we look at the landscape, this is actually on the point crossing the landscape. Here is L'Aquila, just to say. And here is the road that goes towards Sabina. So it's a very important point in the landscape. It has been dug in this weird way because it was actually a commercial archaeology, an emergency archaeology excavation, and then over there they built an entire industrial complex. So now it doesn't exist anymore. This is just one sample, just to give you an idea. These are tumuli, and as you can see, the graves, the shot graves, shot graves, they tend to cluster around them. And sometimes the ancient graves, the most ancient graves, the earliest graves, the yellow ones, are at the center of the tumuli, and then the other graves, they cluster around there. You can see here there are 2 roads, at least, probably meeting somewhere over there and somewhere over here. So it's a very complex funerary complex, but that's not the only one. This one is Fossa. It's this one, is the second one. It's at the very center of the valley. And I think that this is one of the most monumental funerary complex that we have in the area, because all these tumuli are actually preserved. We've got them in the actual mound. And as you can see, it's very dense. This part that is not as dense is because it has not been excavated properly, so they just stopped at the tumuli. But again, same pattern here. There is the tumulus at the center, the ancient tumulus at the center, and then a cluster of graves around it. And this is how it looks today, Fossa. So the tumuli are perfectly preserved, and there are these tails of standing stones, so these lines of standing stones actually signaling the warrior graves of the first phase, so of the 8th century, so the graves of the ancestors, let's say, and we will count that. This is Cinturelli. This is at the very center of the Navelli Plateau. So here, that's the third one. Again, that's a longer road, and that's very clear because the alignment of the graves it speaks for itself. You don't need me to explain it. But there are no tumuli, probably because they have been erased by agricultural wars. But maybe there were somewhere. Like here, it's a space seems to suggest that there were at least 1, maybe 2 or 3. So we don't really know about the clustering of around earlier graves here. But so it's interesting that they're just aligning with the road. And that's the last one. This is the Capestrano Valley. You probably already heard of it for the Capestrano warrior that I'll show you in a bit. As you can see, that's much more spread than the other cemeteries. This is not just one cemetery. This is a proper funerary system. They are like the graves. They are spread all over the valley, at the point that there is some places the graves are denser than in others, but essentially there is continuity between one area and the other, so that it's very spread along the valley. And we can probably call it like a funerary system rather than a proper necropolis. This is the famous warrior of Capestrano that you will probably recognize. He has been found here. And the interesting thing, it's more like a curiosity than other, but the interesting thing is that the grave that the statue is probably associated with is nothing special. It's just another warrior grave. So that's a bit confusing, but that's it. The tumuli here, they are mostly reconstructed or just hypothesized on the base of very faint traces on the ground, but still, they're pretty clear. And again, there is a clustering around them, a cluster of later graves around them. One last thing about necropolis is that, as you can see, so this is in a visibility index. So it means that each of these reddish areas, it means they're very visible from considering all the landscape. So what comes from this picture is that most of the necropolis, they're actually in very visible places like this, and this. Yes, there are some here hidden in the mountains, but still, they're pretty visible. So, just to sum up this part, the necropolis occupy the valley floors and they're highly visible from every corner of each valley. The visibility is enhanced by tumuli, menhirs, and statues. Just to give you an idea, the warrior of Capestrano is more or less that high, so it was probably very visible. Continuity through the centuries, he is assured by the clustering around ancestors' grave. And when I say ancestors, it doesn't mean that they have to be real ancestors. They were perceived as ancestors, but that may be fictional or maybe real. We will never know unless we have some DNA analysis, which we really hope to have in a very short time. Cemeteries are a form of land ownership that happens a lot in a lot of ethnographic cases, and hence they signal identity in the landscape. So they signal ownership of the land that they are occupying. And violence is not really evident in the funerary landscape, but the narrative around it actually is, because all these ancestors' graves are actually warriors. So they build around the idea of the ancient warrior, of the warrior ancestor, and the warrior of Capestrano itself is a warrior. So now we will see about that. So now let's focus on the material culture. This is the basic set of a Vestine warrior. So a spear, a sword, a dolium with a drinking set made of a cup and a jug. So this is just an idea of, okay, this is the total number. The graph represents the total number of males buried in the area. And if you look at the percentage, only the 17% has no weapons in it, and pretty much the half of it has a sword and a spear, which is pretty unique for this period. It means that they had the means or the necessity to bury swords within a grave. It means that the sword and the spear is a very personal object at the point of taking out of the circle of materials. There are no sources of iron in the area. So they were probably expensive. They were imported material, essentially. Well, at least the raw material, the iron, was imported. So that's pretty significant. So these are the swords. They're very nice. I really like them. They've got this very peculiar leaf shape. It's pretty long. It's more or less like this, and has a slight shift of the balance toward the point. That means that it's good for thrusting and cutting. It's a very versatile weapon, and it has a very wide base here. That is good for strong parries, is a good resistance against mechanical stress. So again, it's a very versatile weapon, and it can be directed in a very agile way, putting the thumb here. That seems some counterintuitive, but trust me, it's very efficient. So these are weapons that are made to be used. These are very efficient weapons. They're not just for display. They may be nice. Here, for example, I don't know if you see it, there is a very nice decoration. But still, they are very efficient as a weapon. So spears and javelins, I will not dwell here too long, but the range of typologies, of course, is very wide. And there was a major change in shape at the beginning of the 5th century. So we don't know exactly why, but they felt like they wanted to change the shape. It's not easy to distinguish between a javelin and a proper spear. I think that literature usually divides between the small ones being javelins and the long ones being spears. But I think that Hermann and his team proved very nicely on Bronze Age spears that actually some of the javelins, they've got traces of melee encounter. Like they've got traces of a parry, of an attack. So I think that this study actually challenges many of the assumptions of the functional